Welcome back to the HR Exchange podcast. My name is David Rice. I am your host, as always. I'm joined today by Eric Vogeler. He is the director of the BYU X program. That is the law school over there. And we're going to be talking about a project that they've taken on, looking at the expungement process and people's records. And I think this is pertinent to HR as we look at new employees and kind of get into background checks. It's a topic that obviously is very pertinent to to what HR does. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you, David.
Okay, so you guys have taken on this project and you set a goal to rethink and address flaws in the expungement process that people go through as they try to clear their records. Take me through kind of how you all identified this particular issue and what it was that you wanted to achieve.
Yeah, so in the design thinking process, one thing you want to avoid is coming with preconceived notions or biases, right? And so we as directors, I have two co-directors, Marie Colbeth, Justin Whitaker. We came to this class, this cohort of students, and we had in mind some of what we were interested in. Marie and I are both lawyers. Justin is a designer and a product owner. And so, we've had areas of our practice where we've seen issues or friction that could be improved by the design thinking process. But we wanted the students to own it, right? I do have to admit, I think our biases came into play in selecting expungement broadly, because both Marie and I had a lot of experience in that. Expungement has touched people in our lives, and also we've worked on it in our practice. And so it was kind of a natural fit for this group. And it was one of several topics that we introduced to our cohort and said, if this is one you'd like to explore, we'll go down the path a little bit. We'll read some articles. We'll talk with some experts. If it's not something that the group wants to explore more, we can back up and look at some more broad topics. Thankfully, though, they chose expungement, and it was a great semester.
All right. So they've created this tool. It's called Goodbye Record. Tell me a little bit about that in terms of what does it do, and based on what I've read about it, it seems like you've got a couple different components to it in terms of serving individuals and then a government component as well. It sounds like. So take us through some of that and how it's going to help people through this process.
Sure. So expungement itself is a very personal process, right? It's the one expungee, the person who had a criminal record has now qualified for expungement, and they're ready to move on with their life. At a school like BYU, I mean, this resonated with everybody. This is the mercy side of the justice system. We're saying you paid your debt to society, right? And now we're going to wipe the slate clean. The problem that we identified through our design process through the semester was that on the very back end of it, especially with background checks with regard to employment and with renting, landlord-tenant issues, even though the court system, the state, these government actors might have forgotten, deleted these records, expunged them, there's still a history of them on the internet. And so this is where we really got creative with this solution, because we identified the multiple actors that have to help implement expungement at a systemic level. And so obviously the expungees, there's a component of our site and our solution that's educational. It's to point people who are qualified for or have already obtained expungement to resources that can help them with employment, with rental agreements or disputes. But the other components are aimed at corporations or employers and government actors. So on the employer side, the corporate side, we've asked employers to take a pledge that if they're relying on background checks that might look at criminal histories, that they take a pause and they don't have that be kind of a threshold issue where someone's immediately eliminated if there is some criminal history, because one, it might have been expunged, or two, it might not be so serious that it merits automatic exclusion from their hiring process. And so our pledge is a little more involved than that. And, you know, we've had some good traction with that. But the other component is that government component, where we identified, after talking with the Utah court system, the court system in Pennsylvania, some other administrative offices of courts, where they were unaware, specifically in Utah, they were unaware whether the background check data aggregators were actually updating their databases with regard to expunged records. And so, right, the internet doesn't forget, but these aggregators, right, yeah, these aggregators they can actually take their database, they can update it regularly. And so there are some legislative fixes and some executive fixes, just administrative fixes that any government could easily implement. And so in Utah, we identified at the court system, they just had to update their contract with their data aggregators that were pulling live data from the court system to allow the court to, once records are expunged, ensure that those records have been expunged from the corporate database. They can actually go in and audit that. They have a contractual right to do that now. So yeah, like you said, multifaceted kind of solution, not our typical LawX solution, but in a lot of ways, it was way more fun to design.
In some ways, it sounds like that's as much of a process issue as a legal thing.
Yeah, that's right. And at the end of the day, law is all about process. Like the most fundamental constitutional revolution that America came up with was this notion of due process, that everybody gets their due. And so again, expungement for me, this was so great because the laws are all in place. Utah's actually really forward thinking in terms of expungement. We're fairly progressive. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but it's a comprehensive system. People can qualify for it. There's a new automatic expungement system that's being put into place soon. But the process on the back end was where we saw there were still some issues and difficulties at a systemic level. So yeah, you're right. It's a process solution.
Now, companies can put their support behind this. You mentioned there the Fair Shot Pledge. Kind of tell us a little bit about what goes into that. A little bit about that. What has support been like so far for that? What have you received?
Yeah, early days, right? We launched the website just a couple of weeks ago,
Okay.
but we've had good reaction. We're talking actively with companies, and naturally, we're BYU Law School. We're talking with some law firms. So the initiative itself is fairly simple. It's just a pledge that a corporation or a firm agrees to in its hiring process, essentially help ensure the accuracy of the background checks that they might run, right? It's a little hard on the employer side to know whether your background check provider is operating nicely within the space. So we've just asked employers to do what they can. One of the easy things they can do is to push the background check, and especially the criminal component of a background check, maybe a little further back in the process, so that it's not an automatic disqualifier. Obviously, if someone's got expunged records, those should not be taken into consideration. If they come up, the employer may want to take a look at that information a little more critically and say, hey, look, this was 20 years ago, and they got it expunged. Hopefully that employer will make good use of that information, and if they're otherwise a qualified candidate, would hire them. If they do see errors in their background check, the pledge asks that the employers actually contact their background check provider and correct it. Ask that it be either amended or that they change their process. And then I was actually going to tell you, sorry, blank there, but we've had a really great response actually today. We had been talking with Wilson Sonsini, one of the biggest and best firms, especially in the tech world, maybe the best tech law firm out there, agreed to take the pledge today. And I think we'll get that up on our site here shortly.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So really cool.
You mentioned the background check, kind of vendors there. Is this a conversation you're hoping to have with them as well? And I don't know, is that something that you've had any inroads in, or been able to kind of open any doors?
I think we would love to talk with those providers. There seem to be, I mean, I think there's a lot of background check providers, but they all draw from roughly the same sources. And so, again, this wasn't the focus of our project, but as we continue to kind of build this out and help it get that momentum to where it can be a self-sustaining project, and we're trying to lay the groundwork for that this summer. I'd love to get to talk with some of these providers, LexisNexis, I think Experian. So these are some of the bigger names. And again, they have a huge presence in the law. And so it'd be a really natural fit to go talk with them. And frankly, in our research, we found that the providers themselves, they totally want to be compliant. They don't want to send records to an employer that should have been corrected or amended within their database. Because we discovered that there are federal laws on the books that prohibit that kind of inaccurate information being presented to third parties and relied upon in like hiring decisions. So, these providers, they're like any company. They don't want to be exposed to risk or litigation. And so again, I think they'd be very happy to talk with us too. It's more a matter of just making sure their databases are updated adequately for expungement.
Yeah. So this comes out of the LawX lab, I think it's called. So, which is this is essentially a course based on what I've read. I'm just kind of summarizing here, but this is essentially a course that applies design thinking to legal issues. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm curious about that class, and how does design thinking get applied to these types of problems?
Yeah, this was an initiative that started about 4 years ago. Dean Gordon Smith at the BYU Law School started getting really interested in what design thinking was. And Dean Smith is kind of this cross-pollinating, really interesting character. I mean, he's a good friend. He was my contracts professor, 15 years ago. So we've maintained contact over the years, but he got interested in what this design thinking process could be, especially with regard to lawyers. Lawyers have a really bad habit of taking complex processes and actually like ruminating on and enjoying the complexity of it. I think we get this thrill of, hey, I've made my way through the labyrinth. And it helps us justify our crazy billable rates, right? Like we send a 20-page memo to someone and say, all right, now, after this 20 pages of legal research that cost you $10,000, now you're ready to finally purchase that business. And it's, for us, there's almost no incentive then to actually streamline and flatten processes and improve them. Right? I mean, that's the complaint about lawmakers generally. And so the thought behind LawX, and we have other legal design labs that have sprung up, Stanford primary among them. They run their own legal design lab. And the thought is, hey, let's take these great processes and this thinking that's solution focused, but more importantly, it's iterative and it's making sure that the solutions we're coming up with are tailored to the problem. Lawyers in law school especially, we're just trained to look at problems and issue spot them and say, hey, that's a problem. And then talk about it rather than say, hey, can we get to the root of this and figure out how to solve this problem in the right way. And this year's class was uh, Exhibit A for why design thinking could be really revolutionary for lawyers, because we could have come in to this process for expungement and said, hey, we know what kind of needs to be fixed. Let's just build an app for that, right? We'll bring in our engineering buddies and we'll build an application to make the expungement process easier. But as we got into it and talked with expungement experts and talked with judges and prosecutors and court administrators, we found out there was a much bigger problem for expungees, and that was at the back end. It wasn't the actual process. That's getting streamlined in Utah. It was the practical effects of expungement and getting the benefit of it in employment and in housing. Anyway.
Oh, it's interesting stuff. Yeah, it seems like LawX, it seems like you guys have been tied to some really cool projects in the past. I think I read that there was one dedicated to improving communication between landlords and tenants. There was one to fight debt collection without a lawyer. And some of them become businesses on their own, essentially. This one seems a little bit unique in that it involves sort of these legislative and public interest solutions to a specific social issue. And I'm curious, what led towards that evolution and kind of what's next, because I imagine there's a lot of issues that you could maybe look at through this design thinking lens.
Yeah, you're exactly right. One thing we've been focusing on in the LawX lab is what's called access to justice. It's kind of this broad umbrella of legal issues that face lots of people, and that because of their complexity or their cost or a combination of all that, it can be hard for individuals to actually get redress or get recovery, right? So expungement, classic example. You named landlord-tenant lawsuits. These are, in the law, we call them consumer cases because they're on an individualized basis. It's not something that you typically have a corporation involved. And attorneys are so expensive now that if there aren't corporations involved, there's often not the financial incentive for good legal work from lawyers. And so we have this problem where it's only the corporate law that lawyers want to get into because that's where the money is. And you get this huge disparity between justice being meted out to corporations and justice being meted out to consumers. And so we've been focusing on that area. And to your question about what's next, I have my ideas, my biases. I'll have to talk with my co-directors. One that's been on my mind for a long time, and this hits so many people, is divorce. And in divorce, it's not just the two individuals that are separating. Often it's children, families, and from that, there's just this huge area of law. I mean, family law is really all out of divorce, and you've got child support and alimony and custody and all of these different complex areas where even after a divorce is done and you've got the final divorce decree entered, it could be 20 years that you're still working through alimony issues with the former spouse, with custody issues, it's almost a lifelong issue. And most people don't have $100,000 in their treasury to take care of the divorce issues, right? Like,
no, they don't.
they just don't. And we know, I don't know what the real number is, but the one we talk about is 50% of marriages may end up in divorce.
Yeah, I think I read once it was closer to 60.
So. Yeah. Well, and like I said, everyone's been touched by it. You can, because of that number, even if your marriage stays solvent for all of your life, it's very unlikely you won't have close family members who don't go through divorce. So I'd love to look at some of those frictions in that process, not just the cost itself, but where there's lots of touch points with the court. Man, I had, sorry to get super personal here, but I had a neighbor who, she and her husband went through a divorce. They tried to do it themselves because they're very smart and capable people. I mean, they're both professionals and otherwise, experts in their field, but they were amicable about their divorce. They agreed on everything, child custody, alimony, everything. They took their papers to the court, did everything right, except they forgot to submit a proposed order to the court to sign.
Oh.
And so 2 years later, as I'm talking with one of them, we realize, hey, you guys actually weren't ever divorced. They've been acting like it, right? And so, yeah, I mean, just shocking. But it's because
crazy.
we've created such a complex system and a process that unless you have an attorney, otherwise brilliant people can make these same mistakes. And they shouldn't have to deal with that. I mean, now they're going to have to go back in. They'll probably have to get a lawyer to help them fix it and spend all kinds of money. This is what LawX is kind of designed to look at, is where these problems and frictions occur, and see if we can smooth that out, flatten it out a bit, wherever that may be.
That ultimately sounds like a good thing, and I'm sure your neighbors will be grateful.
I'll let them know that they inspired the next iteration. Again, we'll let the students decide. They may not want to go down the family law route.
Oh, good. Well, Eric, thank you for joining me today.
For sure. David, thank you.
Excellent.